Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome you in today's seminar. We have Dr. Neil Howard. He's half Pakistani because his wife is Pakistani. Uh, Basically, he's son of law of Dr. Khudbai. So, so Dr. Neil, you know that he's basically the anthropologist of development and social protection scholars. Mostly his work is on sustainable development goals. And you know that recently they have launched certain pilot on universal basic income in India, in Bangladesh. So we will definitely learn from Dr. Neil on this universal basic income concept. Dr. Neil, if you look the Constitution of Pakistan, Article 38 says that it is the responsibility of state to provide basic necessaries to all the peoples. So over time, we have expanded our social protection programs. Like, for example, you can see that, like, for example, in 1980, we initiated the Zakat program. It was basically the need-based program, followed by Pakistan Baitul Mal in 1991. Then in 2001, a lot of microfinance programs emerged under the umbrella of Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Program. But still, we don't have any social protection framework. In 2008, BISP was established, and you can see this budget was just 17 billion in 2008, and right now we have 593 billion. So there are a lot of challenges that, okay, after 18th constitutional amendment, social protection is a provincial subject, but federal government is managing a lot of social protection programs, like, for example, PPF. And now we have a dedicated ministry, Pakistan. You can see that Poverty Elevation and Social Safety Division. It was established in August 2019. But unfortunately, still the ministry have no social protection framework. So we have a lot of projects. We don't have any clarity. Now provinces, you know that they are also establishing their social protection authorities. Like, for example, you can see there is Punjab Social Protection Authority. Now there is Sindh Social Protection Authority. And mostly they are donor-supported social protection authorities. So in Pakistan, you can see that over the last 25 years, a lot of donors, they are pushing us to initiate social protection programs. There is PM Health program, there is education subsidies, there are conditional and unconditional cash transfers. But the real dilemma is that a lot of programs, they are mostly the loan. For example, you can see the National Poverty Graduation Program. Right now, it is operational in 23 districts. There is another program that is South Punjab Poverty Elevation Program. Again, it is operational in 10 districts. These programs have plus 90% amount. That is basically the loan of ADB, IFAD, and many other things. So the real question is that what sort of program we require? Targeting is a major issue. BIST has a national socio-economic registry. It's close to census. BIST spent 15 billion rupees to manage their census. And now Punjab government is establishing their own registry for targeting. So targeting is a big challenge, that whom we should target. And usually in Pakistan, we have 250 million population. Targeting is a big challenge that we often face inclusion error as well as, you know, that exclusion error. So whether every province, they will establish their own targeting data, that is a big challenge. Second, what sort of programs we require? Broadly, social protection programs can be categorized into three categories. One is social safety net. Mostly they are non-contributory. In Pakistan right now, we have social safety nets, conditional as well as unconditional cash transfers. Second is social security. Still, we are missing it. And third is social insurance. Still, we are not clear what sort of social insurance we require the program. Second is sustainability. As I mentioned earlier, that all these programs, they have a lot of loan, and you have to pay the loan. I went in Philippines in 2013, and they started their social protection program by designing the fiscal framework of social protection, that, okay, we need money from where we will gather the money. So they impose certain taxes, and that tax amount that was spent on social protection amounts. Right now, Our government is thinking that, okay, dollars are coming. So whether the program is good or bad, let's initiate it. For example, you can see the PM Health program. This program was designed in 2015. Initially, the program give benefit to BISP beneficiaries, but in later we extended the services to all the people. So the program was declared as universal health insurance. And right now this program is closed. So you know that lot of amount was spent in last 9 years, and end result is that the program is closed. So over to you. We welcome you at PIDE, and I hope you will enrich us that what sort of how we can overcome these duplications, financial sustainability, and broadly these programs should that promote equity, resilience, and opportunity for the poor masses. Thank you. Over to you.
So much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the generous introduction. You know my secret now that I am an honorary Pakistani as well. Not quite half Pakistani, although our children are mixed sabzi, half Pakistani, half Gora. And given my family connections here, given the years I have lived here and over in the UK where I'm from, it is quite genuinely and a special honor to have the chance to speak here. This is something I've looked forward to having the opportunity to do for many a year, and have enjoyed seeing family members do. So I'm very grateful to you, sir, for welcoming me, and to you folks here in the audience for coming to listen. I will begin with a caveat. Obviously, you can see I'm Gora, Paka Gora. I'm from London, but not the side of London where many rich Pakistanis themselves also live. I'm from the other side of London, the east, where we don't so much speak English as eat English. So I will often speak really fast and with a very strong accent. If, therefore, I am not clear, please interrupt me. I say this with all sincerity. We are here for the holidays, so I've come halfway around the world, even if we are staying with family. And I would like that time to be used with you understanding me and me obviously understanding you back. So please interrupt. Also, please feel free to ask questions. As a professor in England, I give many lectures where my students are like, or they're on their phone or this, and there are no questions. So if you have the energy to ask questions, don't wait. You are very welcome to put your hands up and ask. Okay? All right. So I'm here to provoke a little bit around this idea of simply giving money to the poor, and why doing so universally and unconditionally is likely more effective than what most countries currently do, including Pakistan, and why Pakistan should consider moving in the direction of experimenting with universality and unconditionality. Okay? I'll introduce my overview understanding of the main pillars of traditional social protection approaches. I'll then speak a little bit about the global movement towards unconditionality, understood in two senses, which I'll go on to explain. And then I'll talk in quite some detail about the experiments that I have been leading elsewhere in the subcontinent. I'll talk you through the methodology. I have given a version of this talk to much less esteemed and much less senior colleagues, where I didn't have to go into super methodological detail. But I know with development economists and economists and students of various disciplines, talking through the methods is going to be important. So I will. I'll then talk about the results, the findings from these experiments, before concluding with a few thoughts about the implications of all of this for Pakistan. I'll also provide a link to a documentary film we have made, which puts in the words of participants who lived these experiments with us, the impact that they had on their lives. All good? All clear? Okay, so the starting point here is that social assistance everywhere in the world can be understood as conditional, and conditional in two senses. The social policy scholar Professor Malcolm Torrey, just published a book entitled Unconditional, reviewing the structure of global social policy, social protection. And he argues that conditionality must be understood as comprising, on the one hand, behavioral conditionality, and on the other hand, categorical conditionality. In other words, targeting. So the first of these, I think, can be broken down quite simply as do this and we will help you. Send your children to school and we will give you some money. Take this vaccination and we will give you some money. Behave in this way and we will give you some money, or not. Very simple. This is not unique to Pakistan. This is not unique to India. This is not unique to where I'm from, the UK. This is a global norm. The second side of the conditionality coin is we'll help you, but only if you are this type of person or you face that type of problem. Maybe you are a lactating mother. Maybe you are a working child. Maybe you have this particular kind of illness, or you have faced this kind of disability. Whatever the approach to targeting may be, the key point is that those who are in a position of power determining who receives social assistance segment the global population into those who receive and deserve to receive for whichever reason, and those who do not. We can understand this as a form of targeted conditionality. Critically, to triple underline the point, this is a global paradigm. Of course, there are unconditional programs. BISP is one of those. But these unconditional programs are unconditional in only one of the two senses above. BISP targets. It may not have behavioral requirements, but it still targets. Other programs will not target, but they will require some form of behavioral adjustment. For example, unemployment insurance in the United Kingdom, where I'm from. So the global paradigm is one of conditionality. That is the starting point. The normative justifications, the way that politicians go about explaining and defending conditionality, in my experience, is almost everywhere identical. I have spoken to people here in Pakistan. I have spoken to very senior politicians and bureaucrats in India and in Bangladesh and in the United Kingdom, working for the United Nations, for the World Bank, in the United States. And across the board, I have heard the same stories, right? The first of those stories, which to some extent can be understood and defended, is that we have to make the best use of limited resources. We are a poor country, or we don't have enough money, or there is lots that we have to spend, and therefore we need to use our money wisely, and we need to give it to those who are most in need. A perfectly understandable and in many ways morally acceptable and defensible position. However, underneath this surface level justification, what I have heard, and I would imagine many of you will have come across as well, are some far more pernicious and judgmental and violent justifications, which are essentially biases and prejudices. Biases and prejudices which are often motivated on class or caste or religious lines. Firstly, the poor will waste it. They don't know what to do. They've never had money, so how can they use it well? I'm sure many of you have heard this. Maybe some of you have even thought this. There are times in my younger life where I will have had certain of these biases. These biases are not about being a bad person. They are the things we are taught to think about the least fortunate in society. So they will waste it. They don't know how to use it. Underlying all of those, I think the most pernicious of all is they don't deserve it. Morally, or for some other reason, they are not entitled. They don't perhaps suffer enough. Others will suffer more than them. Maybe their suffering is their own fault, and therefore we should not give. These are the normative justifications. I put both of our prime ministers up here. Why? Because what I want to underline in their very unpleasant faces is that typically these justifications and these biases will be articulated by those who have power, and those who have power over the people that they judge with these biases. That matters, and I'll come back to it in a moment. Now, in my research, as the kind doctor introduced, I am an anthropologist primarily, which of course means that I am in alien territory when speaking with economists, but I have learned to work with and learn from economists over now many years. But principally, I'm an anthropologist, which means I spend a lot of my time talking to people and looking in depth at the way policies and programs and projects work or don't. And in the course of 15, 20 years of research, particularly looking at the way that social assistance goes wrong, I have arrived at the conclusion that there are at least 4 major problems with this mainstream approach to giving social assistance, which is conditional. The first, of course, is that it hides very questionable distributional assumptions about how much money there is and what we can do with it. When a politician says, but we are a poor country, we don't have that much money to spend, firstly, that's evidently ridiculous in a place that has as much natural wealth as Pakistan, or the UK for that matter. Or when a politician says, the cake is only this big, not everyone can have a slice, we have to cut it in a fair fashion, this starting position sweeps under the carpet all of the prior decisions about how big the cake is. It also elides all of the prior taking of resources that don't end up going into the cake in the first place, right? This is as true in the UK, in the US, as it is in Pakistan and India and elsewhere in the world, right? So we have to, I think, as an a priori political challenge, question whenever a policymaker says we don't have enough. It's not that we don't have enough. It's that those in power have chosen not to make enough available. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and here I come back to what Dr. Sujat was just saying, targeting is woefully inefficient. It excludes many who, even according to the criteria of targeting, are entitled to be included. But on top of that, targeting excludes many similarly worthy groups of people. If you go to any gaon in this country, people will be similarly poor, but maybe only one household is receiving BISP because they happen to be included in the register, or one household is receiving a goat, for example, because they happen to have whatever it may be that the distributor of the goat deems to be necessary. Inherent there is the problem of exclusion, which ultimately is one of violence. On top of this, the third point I'd like to underline is that we know from research all over the world that conditions are often very expensive. The bureaucracy needed to administer targeted approaches to social assistance and the bureaucracy necessary to police behavioral change, these are stratospheric. And in the end, there is a strong case to be made that they are a waste of money. On top of this, of course, many of the behavioral conditions attached to the provision of social assistance are inappropriate to people's lives. This piece, I think, is particularly essential when we reflect on the fact that certain of the conditions, for example, using a cash transfer to spend on your child's school fees, make intuitive sense. We want children to be able to go to school. Very few of us would disagree with this. But if you have a household where the mother falls greatly sick and the only cash available is the money for the child's cash transfer, that family would be making a sensible decision not to send the child to school, but to pay for the mother's hospital treatment. and yet they cannot. This is not an unreal example. I have met people for whom this is true. These are the tragic consequences of imposing conditions that may seem from your Islamabad office to be appropriate, but given that you don't know the lives of the Basti or the Gaon that you're talking about, are not. The last point, deriving from the previous point, is that conditions of both sorts are often violent. They are inimical to human dignity. They hurt people. They shame people. They upset people. They denote that you are stupid, that you don't deserve, that you don't know how to manage your resources, that you are not worthy, whatever it may be. Conditions we know involve the poor having to interact with stigmatizing bureaucracies. I mean, it's bad enough if I go to Nadra or to pick up a license of some sort. I'm sure it's bad enough for many of you. But as you well know, for the very poor and the very excluded, it is unimaginably worse. And this is, again, not unique to Pakistan or South Asia. These experiences are documented as universal. Latin America, Africa, Europe, interactions with governmental bureaucracy for the poor are typically painful and stigmatizing. For me, these reasons alone are enough to say bus with conditionality, right? But there are more. And what I want to underline is that it's not just me, an excitable young researcher saying, look, that's silly. Let's be idealistic. Let's move beyond conditionality. There is now a global movement of policymakers, of civil servants, of activists, NGOs, researchers, ordinary citizens, literally now on every continent saying, let's move beyond conditionality in both forms, and let us move towards unconditionality. Just to talk you a little bit through this slide, BIEN, the Basic Income Earth Network, is a worldwide organization with chapters in something like 60 countries, of which I am a member, advocating for basic income, which I'll go on to speak about and define in a moment. You have the book which gave the title to my talk, Just Give Money to the Poor, now one of the most celebrated textbooks in social protection literature from the last 20 years. Give Directly. Anybody heard of Give Directly? Give Directly is an American NGO, huge NGO now. Many American NGOs, I can imagine you might think suspicion, with good reason. Many of them are terrible. These guys, what do? They literally just give money to the poor. They have a budget of $1 billion and they spend 99% of it just giving money. They say no conditions. We don't know. The poor know. Let's give money to them. There are also political developments, very important political developments, some of which are here in South Asia, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk, but some of which are much further afield. The UBIC, this is the logo of a coalition, the Universal Basic Income Coalition in South Africa, which is a massive nationwide coalition, including political parties, much of whom are, many of whose members are derived from the struggle against apartheid, saying we need a nationwide universal minimum cash grant for all citizens. In Brazil, there are certain municipalities that have already moved towards adopting this. So I tell you this simply to drive home the fact that the idealistic and radical proposal that I bring to you isn't actually that crazy after all, because there are millions of people around the world who are sharing it and taking it forward. Now, importantly, within this global movement, just as there are two sides to conditionality, there are two sides to unconditionality. On the one hand, the absence of behavioral requirements, no strings attached. And on the other side, the absence of any targeting. In other words, universality. Everyone. The simple maxim that underpins this move towards unconditionality is make sure that all people have the resources they need and trust them to use them well. Very, very simple, very, very intuitive, and enormously radical when compared to the main approach to the provision of social assistance. And this move is encapsulated, in my estimation, most thrillingly and most promisingly in the movement towards a basic income. Who here has heard of the term basic income? Amazing. Yes? Okay. What is a basic income for those of you who have not yet heard? Who here has heard of a pension? A basic income is nothing other than a pension for everybody, as I understand it. A pension is a cash payment given on a regular basis that cannot be taken away, that is usually not means tested and has no work requirement. In other words, it's unconditional in behavioral terms and is given to people because they are old, simply in order to support their survival. A basic income takes this principle and extends it to everybody. So it's a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. Basically, as I understand it, if in capitalism, in money-based society, we have to have money in order to survive, in order to do anything, right? If you have no money, unless you are a subsistence farmer, you die. It's that simple, right? Or if someone doesn't give you money, you die. So without money, there's nothing we can do. The logic of a basic income is to make the promise of freedom that capitalists often put before us more real. In other words, it says if you have to live in money-based society, then at least you have a minimum monetary stipend to help you survive and to pay for the basic necessities of life. Are you following me? This is, of course, a totally crazy idea, right? If you say to anyone, well, let's just give money to the poor, and then on top of that, let's give money to absolutely everybody, of course they will say, what? We can't do that. It's unthinkable, you know? It's like saying 50 years ago, 60 years ago, we could put a man on the moon. It's like saying 400, 500 years ago, the world is round. And at the same time, when you think about it, when you step into reflecting on its possibility, you recognize that it is actually the most obvious and simple and intuitive response to poverty that we can imagine. Because what is poverty? It's the absence of resources. And if we wish to address poverty, as every social policy scholar, social protection advocate, political leader at least says they want to do, then there is no simpler way than simply giving people a basic amount of regular money. I have told this story a number of times, but I'll tell it again because I love it. There's a Brazilian senator, huge figure in Brazilian politics, called Eduardo Suplicy, who was part of the first Lula administration and who had adopted in the Brazilian constitution a commitment to a progressive rollout of basic income for all Brazilians. And he says, sometimes the easiest way out is through the door. I like this because it's an amusing reminder that sometimes the easiest way to address poverty is just to give people the money that they lack. Now, there is, alongside this global movement advocating giving money to the poor, a global movement of research, including the research of my colleague here, looking at efforts to simply give money to the poor. First, in the form of cash transfers, and now, more excitingly, in the form of basic income. The difference between cash transfers and basic income being that basic income takes both sides of the unconditionality coin instead of only one. I have been involved in that research for the past 7 or 8 years. And what I'll talk to you now about for the rest of our time together are the policy experiments that I was running in India and in Bangladesh. So over 2 years, in each case, myself and my colleagues and the organizations that we worked with provided unconditional basic income to all residents of 5 bastis. So we wanted to simulate universality. You know, BISP, one household will receive, one household not. Maybe this household receives, that household doesn't. Likewise, in a randomized control trial, you know, I receive, you don't, he does, she doesn't, right? In our project, every resident of these bastis received. So we were able to simulate, to some extent, universality. And of course, the cash was delivered unconditionally. We also accompanied the cash with social work, basically, and in particular, the provision of sort of similarly unconditional relational support delivered by community organizers. So these two interventions combined each of the sides of the unconditionality coin that I was mentioning to you before. In the one case, we worked with 350 households, so about 1,500 people in India, in Hyderabad. And in the other case, we worked with 1,500 households, so about 6,000 or 7,000 people. And this was an entire neighborhood of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. On aggregate, the amount that was transferred worked out at about 25% of household income. So it was not unimportant, but it was also not crazy, right? And the logic there was it was going to be enough to make a meaningful contribution to people's lives, whilst being low enough to plausibly be replicated by a progressively inclined government. And these were figures we arrived at through dialogue with civil society, UN Valas, various folks who have the ear of power. It's clear so far in terms of design? Please.
Whether this income vary across household or amount was the same?
Good question.
Because you know that you are mentioning 25% of household income. So some might be poor, some might be in middle class. Yeah.
Very good question. So almost everybody that participated was poor. Some were extremely poor and some were middling poor, let us say. There were a couple of households in each cases that were decently well off or well enough off, and they also received because we were mimicking universality. The amount that any given household received varied by household size. So we pegged the transfer in the case of India, for example, at 1,000 rupees per adult and 500 rupees per child given to the mother. Individual household receipt, and of course, every household pooled their money in one way or another, varied up and down, but the sort of net impact or the net amount per household was, broadly speaking, the same ratio given the varying sizes of the households. This is simply to restate that both parts of these interventions adopted these two principles, right? Or these two halves of the unconditionality coin. Zero behavioral requirements, no strings attached of any sort, and no targeting. Not one household receives and the neighbors don't, everybody receives. It's important that I also underline that where certain basic income pilots around the world give only cash, and with good reason, because they want to demonstrate the power of unconditional cash to policymakers still unwilling to listen, we did that and we provided the community organizer support. Why? Our starting point is that, of course, cash matters. It's the sine qua non in capitalism. In cash-based society, you have to have it. But it's not the only form of power that exists. Relational power, collective power is also possible to develop, particularly if you approach the provision of social support in similarly dignifying, unconditional ways. And there's much to be said about the interaction with the work or between the work of these organizers and social workers and the cash itself. How much detail do you want in terms of the methodology? I know you're economists. Economists love detailed methodological conversations. Shall I go into a bit? Medium? Not so much? Sir? Medium, Teak. Then I'm going to skip this slide. The big picture point is that in both Dhaka and in Hyderabad, we combined multiple rounds of multiple methodological approaches to finding out what changed for who, under which conditions, and in which ways. What that meant was 4 rounds of survey in each case, baseline, midline, endline, and then a follow-up survey. In each case, that was a priori with a census. In the case of Dhaka, the community organizers also used tablets to take bi-monthly, very simple monitoring surveys, asking basic questions like, how are you coping with shocks? And how do you feel about your ability to cope with shocks? As well as things about household composition and simple effectiveness of the delivery of the cash. We also did a lot of qualitative work. My fellow anthropologist in the corner will be able to attest to this. Qualitative work is just talking to people, right? Much as we like it to sound very complex, it's basically talking to people at length over multiple iterations. And what that meant was a subset of households selected based on various criteria. Either they were particularly poor, or they were women-led households, or they had children who are working, or there were disabled members of the household, or whatever it might be. And our research team went back and interviewed them round after round after round in order to probe particular thematics. We also conducted lots and lots of focus groups, bringing together groups of young people, groups of women, groups of men, groups according to occupation. And we had PhD students living within the communities and spending time with people at length in order to get at the thick stories, if you will, the thick description of social life that is only possible if you live and work with people in ways that I, as the father of multiple children, could not do. This is broadly speaking the timeline in India, which paralleled more or less what happened in Bangladesh. And you can see that the modules that we had, the quant modules, included things like assets, family profile, people's sense of their freedom and their agency, what they did with their time, how their work changed or didn't, what they spent their money on. Given that both experiments combined two arms, I want to say a little bit about how we disaggregated the impacts, right? In other words, how did we work out which bit was caused by the cash, which bit was caused by the community organizing, and which bits were caused by the interaction between the two, okay? In the case of Dhaka, we had a control group, actually by accident. I am not ethically a fan of randomized control trials unless the control group goes on to receive the treatment, which is obviously beneficial, in this case, cash, right? And we didn't have the cash to provide that to everybody. And so we said, no, control group. A parallel survey was conducted at the same time, however, of the neighborhood next door. So something like a natural experiment took place, and we then conducted a follow-up census at the end of the experiment in this neighboring community to establish some kind of statistical control. We also had regular specific questions in both the quant and the qual about disaggregated impacts. What was your highest rated impact of the cash? How did the two interact? This kind of thing. And then most importantly of all, given that this was our evaluative approach was broadly speaking theory-based rather than randomized. In other words, there are a set of detailed theoretically backed hypotheses about what would happen that our researchers then investigated. They investigated these using in-depth qualitative research that provided the kinds of causal impact insights that are just not possible when all you do is survey people and leave. One, just as an example, I'll go on to talk about these a little bit more, but as an example of how we then made sense of these disaggregated impacts, we, and by we I don't mean me at all, as I have mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, I do not do numbers at all, but thankfully there are very numerically inclined people in our team that do, constructed contribution scores, pulling together the perception of change in any given domain and the amount that people considered that to be influenced by the cash or by the organizing. And these contribution scores range across domains from including, slum improvement, access to education, ability to earn, so on and so forth. I'll say more in more detail, we'll share more detail about each of them in a moment. In terms of findings, what I want to start by kicking off with, what I want to address off the bat are the misconceptions that, at least in my experience, commonly attach to conversations around unconditionality, especially when talking to the powerful. I cannot tell you the numbers of times that I have spoken to ministers or bureaucrats, and I particularly remember galling instances in Bangladesh where these misconceptions are just, they rule the roost. So the first, which no doubt you will have come across as well, is that people will waste the money. As I was mentioning earlier, this bias that the poor are feckless or useless or they will be wasteful. The assumption often being that they will use their money on drink or on drugs. We did not find this. Very small, isolated instances across the sort of thousands of people that participated, but statistically, this is infinitesimal, right? So there was no massive wastage of money. The sort of more productivist capitalist overlords in the governments that I've spoken to are also always concerned about people stopping work. You know, well, if you give money to the poor and they don't have to work, then they won't work, and then society will fall apart. We didn't find anything of this nature. At times, we found precisely the opposite. Again, coming back to the assumption that I mentioned above around the fecklessness, the naivety of the poor, we found that people made appropriate and contextually relevant choices, which varied massively. So perhaps one of the major findings of each project is that people's needs vary so dramatically based on their individual household circumstances that even if there are commonalities in how people use the money and use the organizing support, the differences are what actually characterizes what happens. That, in and of itself, I think is precisely a justification for a universal and unconditional approach, because household needs will always vary. Your circumstances, maybe a certain trouble that you have with a family member, a daughter. Maybe perhaps you have someone who is disabled in your house. Maybe perhaps you have someone who can't access school. Maybe I have whatever number of problems it might be. But the key point is, in cash society, cash is what is flexible and fungible, and giving it to people and stepping out of the way is what enables them to respond to the variability of the challenges. Unsurprisingly, people really appreciated the universality, the fact that everybody within the community was in receipt of social assistance rather than one household and not another. Once again, given what we know about targeting in terms of its tendency to trigger shame and to trigger resentment, and its tendency to be inefficient in the sense that it excludes, including everybody was profoundly welcome by all of the community members that we worked with in each of the 5 communities. Indeed, there was a sense of community that derived from the inclusion of all, which I'll say more about later. And lastly, in contrast to the paradigm that I outlaid above, unconditionality, the absence of any form of conditions and the absence of targeting, and critically the trust embedded within that, was appreciated and effective. In very brief terms, in one slide, these are the summary of our findings. Basically, impacts were positive across all of the domains that you would imagine them to be. When I've presented this work to policymakers, I have been hugely inclined to put this slide on the stage and then walk off. Because for me, this is enough. Very, very little more is needed from a justificatory standpoint when you look at the unambiguously positive impacts across life domains. But I'll tell you in detail what they were. These graphs are from Bangladesh. You will notice the jump from 7 to 8. Right? Is that clear? Everybody can see these jumps? These graphs are the plots of the findings from the bi-monthly monitoring survey that the community organizers took across all of the households in the community that we worked. You'll recall that survey was very simple, very light touch, 10 or 11 questions that were about, household income, ability to cope, shocks, etc. The whole point was simply to check how people are going, right? The difference between 0.7 and 0.8 is that 0.8 is when the basic income began. So like that, there's a jump in people's material well-being, people's circumstances, and a decrease in their poverty. We found similar things in India. Of course, increased income in any circumstance of poverty also means increased resilience. As I'm sure all of you know, any basti in the subcontinent, health is going to be one of the major crises that people face, right? Someone is going to get sick. When they get sick, they can't work. That means they forego their earnings. They may then also forego the access to this particular earning opportunity because they will be so precarious. For example, they are waste pickers or waste collectors. They don't collect the waste, they lose the segment of the colony that was theirs. Then on top of all of this, they have to pay for the health costs and the health treatment that is typically regressively expensive, as a consequence of which they end up in further debt. And the cycle of debt continues, and debt is nothing other than selling part of today for tomorrow, right? Also a form of social control. Having more cash obviously increases people's resilience. In the context of poverty, cash is power, right? And it means that people can absorb health shocks, for example, amongst other shocks, in ways that are less pernicious. They don't necessarily have to send a child out to work. They don't necessarily have to sell their jewelry. They don't have to necessarily take the same kind of loan. These graphs report school dropout rates over the 2-month periods. And once again, you'll see that at the shift between 0.7 and 8 across the age cohorts, there's a drop in the amount of kids who are dropping out of school to go to work. Why? Because the basic income has provided these poor families with a degree of material liquidity to absorb the shocks that characterize life on the margins. I mentioned before that our economists constructed these contribution scores, and you'll note how important people considered the cash to be for the quality of their young people's education, for the quality of school attendance, and indeed for child protection more broadly. All, of course, tied into and perhaps summarizable as resilience to shocks. All of this is intuitive, of course, right? I mean, I must emphasize, I've spent 7 years doing this work. I expected to find everything that I found. But when you talk to policymakers and you try to leverage and shift power, you really need to show them the obvious, and you need to show them the obvious in thick social scientific terms. And that's essentially what we have done. Savings and debt. Once again, busties around the world are characterized by high levels of indebtedness, right? And typically, people are taking short-term loans at very high rates of interest. In Hyderabad, where we were working in India, households were taking things like daily loans, daily finance, they were called. So on a daily or weekly basis, a loan shark will come around and offer small bits of money, which are typically used to buy, things that people will sell on a daily basis. Mugu, granite powder, for example. Many of the community members we worked with are mugu sellers. Mugu is the decorative powder that Southern Indians put outside their homes. 35% of our households said they were able to pay off long-standing debts, and 88% of them attributed this to the basic income. These are huge figures in a context of ubiquitous indebtedness, right? Interestingly, though, 62% of households also took on new loans and attributed that to the cash transfers. What does that tell us? It tells us that the composition of money flows has changed. In other words, having greater financial security by virtue of having unconditional cash meant that people could pay off the bad loans and take better ones. We see similar things on the other side in relation to saving, but I won't bang on too long because I've already been talking for a while. Obviously, asset ownership increased substantially across the board. We saw people buy rickshaws so that someone could go and work as a rickshaw wala. People bought motorbikes so that they could go and sell their wares. One of my favorite stories, if not my favorite story, which is at the heart of the documentary we've made, is of a woman called Shobha in Hyderabad, who is a single parent and works as a garbage collector, and invested her money principally on a washing machine. Policymakers, particularly patriarchal policymakers, will plausibly tell you that that's a waste. Good example of the poor being feckless. Why would she buy a washing machine when she could have sent her children to a private school or saved up for a productive asset? Anyone who tries to juggle a home and work will tell you that a washing machine is perhaps the greatest of all inventions, right? Other than a TV, which will allow you a brief respite from your children. But a washing machine saves you 3 or 4 hours washing your children's clothing. For this woman to be able to buy a washing machine, not only did multiple hours open up in her day, but there's a sense of dignity attached to her being able to send her children to school clean and on time, right? So these are transformative impacts of a very small nature that are huge in the life of the life of any given poor person. Yeah, the three combined words at the bottom really summarize this. One of my PhD students was looking for little catchphrases. Basically, the assets that people bought were dignity enhancing, revenue generating, and time creating. Again, all of which is, broadly speaking, intuitive, because what would any of us spend extra money on if we had extra money to spend on things? Predictably, the impact on people's health was also notable. In India, these figures are all from India, there was a 10% reduction in households selling assets to finance the health shocks, right? This is a substantial number of people we're talking about. 18% of people increased the use of health insurance, which is one of the more powerfully transformative, when it works, anti-poverty tools that we know to exist in the subcontinent, precisely because health shocks are so traumatic and so re-immiserating. A quarter of households reported a decline in food insufficiency. Often we heard stories about people being able to buy better food. In Bangladesh in particular, I would hear a lot, Eid now we can eat meat. The children can eat meat. Before, people could not. It was dal chawal and that's it. Again, materially important in the now, materially important in the tomorrow by virtue of the accrued health benefits, and subjectively vital in terms of people's human dignity and self-respect. Simply to say, from this slide, food security was also improved as a result of the cash transfer. What this slide tells you is the story deriving from the somewhat fortuitous controlled control trial element of the research design. North Gorge Mahal was the neighborhood that we worked in, and Balamat was the neighborhood next door. As I mentioned earlier, we were able to obtain data that was census data before and after in Balamat, and to compare that against the trend data that we saw from our census with residents in North Gorge Mahal. And what the difference in the numbers between the two basically tell you is that the cash transfer had a dampening effect. Life, in many respects, got worse for everybody because of the massive price shock that ripped across all of South Asia and much of the rest of the world in the years of this experiment. But the negative impacts in terms of people's food security in the community that we worked in was dampened, was reduced by virtue of people having a secure cash flow to top up their earnings. People's well-being, people's stress, people's ability to cope is the relationship between these and poverty is very well documented, as well as being entirely intuitive. The poorer you are, often the more stressful your life is. Often the more challenging it is to know that you'll be okay from today to tomorrow, right? In the middle of these slides, you'll see a jump from 10% to 60% of households who thought that their ability to earn enough income improved. This is an astronomical jump, right? We're talking 500% increase. Over half of the community went from thinking, I'm not quite sure that we will be able to earn enough, to thinking, yeah, we'll just be able to get by. Likewise, the graph beneath that in the center on the bottom, we see a jump of similar scale in households' capacity to resolve sudden changes in work and health, right? So if precarity and the constant buffeting by shocks is characteristic of life as a poor person, and this is very much the case everywhere, not just across the subcontinent, then just how remarkable is it that the provision of a small but secure cash floor has an effect that is that substantive? The last one, and this will take me towards the end and the pieces that for me are most emotionally substantive. 50% jump in people thinking that their feelings of being in control in their own life improved. How basic is the feeling of either being or not being in control of your own life? And how much that all of us who have privilege take that feeling for granted? And how painful and constitutive is it when you don't have that privilege? And under conditions of basic income, more people were able to enjoy it. Again, for me, if I were a policymaker, that would be enough. Ties into the contribution scores. Huge numbers of our community identified as one of the most important contributions of the cash, hope for the future. Again, I mean, The emotional impact here is really off the page. What I really want to emphasize, therefore, and this ties back into what I was saying at the beginning about the stigmatizing and violent and excluding and exclusive and shaming approach and consequences of the approach to social assistance that is conditional, and the contrast between that and the potential of unconditionality. At the heart of this is dignity. The relationship between dignity and poverty is well documented. Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winning economist, who I'm sure you've all heard of and no doubt also think is pretty cool, famously said that shame is at the irreducible core of poverty. It's the nucleus, it's in the DNA of being poor, right? And anyone who has ever experienced being poor, and maybe some of you have, I have, believe it or not, knows that shame is at the very heart of being poor. And by contrast, many efforts to alleviate poverty, particularly through unconditionality, put dignity at their heart, as we did. And what we found was that dignity was probably the most important thing that people said that they received through the provision of unconditional cash and unconditional community worker support. And in this piece, I really want to emphasize how important cash itself is. There are many that I know and have worked with on the left who, and in progressive spaces more broadly, who quite rightly are suspicious of money and will emphasize the power of human relations and looking eye to eye across class or caste or religious differences as a way of dignifying. And there's much truth to that. If you sit down in the dirt and you look eye to eye, there is a dignifying element to that exchange. But in the end, particularly if you are speaking across boundaries, you leave and they stay. And they're still poor, right? That same tension was very apparent for all of our community organizers, right? They were in our communities with total solidarity, with no a priori, you should do this to fix your problems. And they were greatly appreciated and respected, but still, there is a difference around material circumstances. However, the provision of unconditional cash transformed the way that the community organizers were viewed because they were associated with that cash. Because people who are poor fundamentally need money to address the pain points deriving from their poverty. So actually, paradoxically, while money can be thought of as lifeless, as dead, as not containing the emotional power of a look into the eyes or a hug or a handshake, precisely because money is what characterizes, or the lack of money is what characterizes your life as a poor person, actually that has almost more dignifying power. And across every single one of the busties that we worked in, the overwhelming message was money matters, and the fact that it's given unconditionally, words cannot describe. Necessarily, of course, outside of the receipt of money, what money enabled people to do was also dignifying, right? People could negotiate their shame, for example, by buying things for people that needed them, their children, being able to give gifts at ceremonies. One story that really marked me was a grandmother, Zaira, who is very, very old and who made her living through alms collection. She sat outside the mosque and she collected alms, right? And we thought, well, that's a kind of difficult way of making your living. When she receives a basic income, maybe she'll stop. But she didn't. She continued to collect her alms and got by through collecting her alms, but then used her basic income to buy sweets for her grandchildren. Because that was what gave her a sense of meaning and purpose, as well as belonging, and enabled her to transition from the emotional experience of shame to one of dignity. Again, for me, that's enough. I just push the basic income button right now after this. But, policymakers appear to be lacking in the dill at times. Work. What happened when it came to work? Unsurprisingly, because both of these experiments were time-bound, people didn't just up and leave. In India, the vast majority of our participants were waste collectors. They worked in garbage collection in a subcontracted relationship with the city corporation. Very heavily caste structured work. Everybody is from the same caste, and all of this caste do that work. So the barriers to exit are high. They're unlikely to find better employment or even any employment, certainly not something approximating security amidst the precarity. So they stayed, which is a shame in many respects. And I think plausibly would change if a basic income were delivered permanently. But what they did do and what they did change overwhelmingly was they reduced their working days from 7 to 6. Because of their poverty and because of their precarity, waste collectors have to go to work at 4 o'clock in the morning every day. And 50% stopped during the basic income and went to work 6 days a week, hiring someone else to do the other day. So a massive change in terms of people's lived experience, if not a revolutionary overhaul of the quality of life. I'm coming towards the end, and I want to emphasize a couple of final pieces. One is that in the case of India, 91% of our households reported improved community relations. This is an astronomical figure, and it very much flies in the face of assumptions that many progressives make about the pitfalls of providing individual or household-based cash transfers. At least where I come from, you hear the concern amongst union ballas that these are alienating forms of social assistance that remove any collective capacity. Because we added a community organizing component to this, and because of the universality of receipt, we found precisely the opposite. And that manifests itself in a whole suite of collective action. In India, folks, mothers from the women's groups that were facilitated successfully lobbied for the setting up of an Anganwadi so that they could leave their children and go and work. Innumerable collective savings and chit funds, the establishment of study spaces, perhaps most importantly, the establishment of a monthly health camp where doctors from a nearby hospital associated with an NGO came and provided free healthcare for hundreds and hundreds of people who previously only went to the pharmacy or went to some quack, right? Most excitingly, those examples were primarily from Bangladesh, but most excitingly in India, the communities of garbage collectors united to set up what is, for all intents and purposes, a union of garbage collectors for the city of Hyderabad. And they have made demands and presented them to the chief minister and to the relevant bureaucrats, and are continuing to advocate for essentially the formalization of their roles. This would not have been possible either without the cash or without the community organizing. And once again, is a unique example of the transformative potential of this approach to social assistance. I will stop basically, but I want to say a couple more things about what this may or may not mean for here. The first thing to say is that although these are isolated examples of basic income pilots, there's only been one other basic income pilot of this scale that's taken place in South Asia. The impact of these pilots and the preceding pilot in India has been massive, particularly on the political conversation. The Congress Party in the last election promised some form of basic income. That was directly as a result of the advocacy that our team did with his team on the back of this particular pilot. And that was before we had our final findings. What does that point to? It points to something that is now well documented around the world, particularly in the US, in Brazil, and in Southern Africa, that pilots as sort of mediatized spectacles that bring in the chattering classes, that involve well-placed civil society or political champions, are tools for blowing open political conversations that otherwise could not have been had. The transition that is currently underway in Bangladesh has provided an opening for similar conversations and impacts there, and we are seeing precisely those take place. The limitations of targeted, behaviorally dependent, conditional forms of social assistance that I spoke about earlier characterize social assistance in Pakistan. just as they characterize social assistance in India. But now in India, increasingly in Bangladesh, we are seeing, partially as a consequence of this research and partially as a consequence of its prior a decade ago and the social movement that is attached to it, we are seeing a wave of change. More and more pilots are being promised, more and more cash transfer programs are being rolled out, which are unconditional in one of the two senses, right? The spread of these ideas is reaching Sri Lanka, where there are conversations around a pilot. It's reaching Nepal, where UNDP is funding the next South Asian basic income pilot. And my hope is that through conversations like this and others, it will begin slowly to lap onto the shores of Pakistan. Because for Pakistan, I think if only to not be left behind South Asian neighbors, the time for talking about whether or not we need to be piloting unconditionality in both senses here has to be ripe. I think there is a lot more that could be said about political linkages, political opportunities, political openings, and that's far more for those of you in this audience than it is for me, given your expertise in here that I don't have. But I will conclude basically with a plea. Let us think about how and whether and when and where it may well be a time for piloting something like a basic income and what implications that might have for progressive social assistance provision and politics more broadly. Thank you.
A lot of our social protection program in Pakistan, they also aim that they are doing a lot for community strengthening. For example, Pakistan Poverty Elevation Program, NRSPs, and right now we have rural sports program networks. And model of all these programs that is based on strengthening the community organizations. But you have to critically evaluate. Let's evaluate the NRSP. Let's evaluate the PPF. That how much these VOs, COs, they are practically sustainable. Whatever I have observed that, okay, these programs are throwing the money. So, okay, community is available there, but when you know that there is no money, these COs are abolished. So you have to see that how these COs can be strengthened and in which environment we can strengthen them.
That's a great question.
Coming to Neil lecture, I agree that conditionality have certain cost. For example, I served in BISP from 2015 to 20. So right now, BISP is giving amount to ever married women. So criteria is ever married women. Recently, one lady approached me who have the age of 70 years, but she's not married. So program denied to grant its benefit because since you are not married, so we cannot give you the amount. Same could be another condition. We started the Wasila Talim program in 2012. So condition was that, okay, the children must be enrolled in student and she must have this minimum 70% attendance criteria. So I calculated that we were spending 40 rupees just to fulfill the condition because one dedicated person, he's going in school, he's getting attendance. So 40 rupees against 100 rupees disbursement. So 40% is the administrative cost. So this model is okay. It look quite simple that, okay, there is no condition. You are paying amount to all the people. Like, for example, in a country like in Pakistan, we have the Nadra database where I think every child who is usually born, you have the BayFarm registered data. So model is quite simple. Okay, that's fine. But you know that this is not too simple as well. Uh, Sustainability and scalability, that matters a lot. So Neil, I want to listen from you on that. For example, you can do pilot in, for example, a few villages, 10 villages. But for example, in a country like Pakistan, where you have 250 million population, so I was calculating that, okay, if you pay 100 rupees to one person, you require 25 billion per month. And if you pay 1,000, then you require around 250 billion amount. So this scalability, how? And second, sustainability, for how many period we have to pay the amount. I think in your pilot, you have paid 11 installments. It might be monthly, 11 period.
18.
Okay, 18. Yeah. So where is the graduation? Where we will end up? And you know that in Pakistan we are spending on education, we are spending on health, and you know that these are also some sort of social protection or subsidized program. For example, if you go in a government hospital for treatment, you will not pay too much amount. Same could be in you know that government education, etc. So how, for example, we can full-fledged implement such sort of programs? Yeah, please.
Community organization, sustainability, and problems with community organizations. So community organizations, development wallahs, social workers, very typically, pretty much across the board, approach what they do in similarly conditional fashion, right? There will be behavioral requirements. I will be offering you a cow, but not a goat. I'll be offering you seed. Maybe you don't even have a field you can plant it in, right? A priori approaches to the provision of social assistance. What was different in what we did was there was nothing a priori. They had no instructions other than to listen, to build trust, and then to collaborate. And as a consequence, the responses and the responses to people's problems emerged rather than being imposed, and were appropriate and contextually responsive in ways that is just impossible if you have a pre-designed schema. I say this because I want to emphasize that my understanding of the importance of unconditionality goes beyond unconditionality as cash. It's unconditionality as social assistance. Can it be sustainable absent ongoing funding? I'm not sure. Can anything be sustainable absent ongoing funding? I am not sure. And I think we have to confront the real possibility that social change, progressive transformation, cannot only come through the heroic efforts of self-organizing communities or unfunded community organizations. In the end, this work takes time, and time requires money. So for me, when the question is posed, how sustainable are interventions without ongoing support? The response is, why can't there be ongoing support? This, I think, links into the point about scalability and kind of sustainability if we are imagining a scheme of this nature on a national scale. I'll tell you sort of a parallel story. In Nepal, 20 years ago, they were going to introduce an old age pension. And of course, policymakers, commentariat, where are we going to get the money? It's going to be impossible. We can't. And so, oh, thank you so much. And so when the pension was introduced, they said, okay, well, we'll just introduce it anyway. We'll see what happens. It was introduced at a very low sum. Let's call it 1. Progressively, it becomes attractive. It becomes important. It becomes politically useful. And now that sum has expanded 20-fold, right? What that tells me, and these stories are paralleled elsewhere where I come from, certainly, is that if programs such as the provision of social assistance become politically attractive, the money will be found. And there is no clearer example of this than BISP, the budget for which has expanded, as you've been saying, exponentially. So it's not a question of whether money exists. It's a question of whether those who are in the position to distribute it can access it and then distribute it equitably, which ties into a sort of further response that I would have here to all of the questions around how viable a universal scheme can be in any country, because let me underline, the question around scalability and universality and the absence of targeting is one that I get in England as often as I get it in Pakistan. I would respond to anyone who is faced with that question by saying, you have to keep pushing for universality anyway, right? Do not give up the sort of the flame. Do not extinguish the flame of the direction of travel that we need to be working towards rather. The responsibility of the public intellectual, the responsibility of progressive civil society, I think, is to say, look, there's the top of the mountain. That's where we need to be. We don't actually know how to get there, but we know that's where we've got to go, right? And so even if we don't right now know where the money is going to come from, we can look around us and see that the money exists in society. And therefore, the question is, how are you going to make sure that you get it to distribute it?
Assalamualaikum. I'm Memuna. I'm a student of MPhil Economics. I thank you for what you left us with. It's sheer food of thought.
Thanks.
and I believe it's an amazing base for action as well. However, one of the slides showed that there was a timeline where there was an association of the start of cash and then the end of cash.
Mhm.
Does that by any means imply that those busties were not paid anymore?
Yeah, it's exactly what it implies. These were
Did we
both.
check on them?
Yes, of course. We are actually in the process right now of going back. So we checked on them in two senses. In the social scientific sense, follow-up research is being conducted now. But in the more moral, ethical sense, we worked with community organizers embedded in these communities, in part as a way of ensuring people's security, right? And so everybody who participated in the project, there were months of lead up explaining this is an experiment, it's unconditional, and it's time bound. So it will run for 18 months. For this period of time, you will receive the money, and then that money will stop. And over the course of the project, those conversations continued to prepare people for the fact that life circumstances would change again. So in the end, we trusted people. People had the choice. We gave them informed consent, basically. Would you like to participate or not? Of the 7,500, I think 3 said no. Fair enough. But of course, quite intuitively, the vast majority said yes. But that doesn't mean, I mean, we were careful, of course, as careful as I think can be, but that doesn't mean it wasn't difficult for folks. And I met people who were unsure if they'd be able to continue paying school fees, who were sad because they've moved back or they're likely to move back into greater precarity. And this remains a source of sadness for me and pain. And for many development and social policy folk is oh, well, there you go. It shows that it's a waste of money. You can't do it because these short-term interventions, they can't be sustainable, much like the graduation approach. To me, for me, I take a different conclusion. It tells me something different, which is this needs to be non-withdrawable, right? It's not that you stop being precarious under capitalism just because of an experiment. You know, the idea of graduating is an entirely neoliberal idea that somehow suddenly you will be more of an entrepreneur. You're better able to make some money, but you're still dependent on the market, right? The idea of a non-withdrawable cash transfer is that it's a shift of distributional relations. So you have an unconditional degree of social support, and that's permanent. And so that permanency, I think, is one of the most transformative aspects in this idea. And our data, the follow-up data that shows how non-permanent some of the changes were, I think paradoxically makes the case for permanence as a social policy. Thank you for the question.
So I would request the online participants to just raise their hands, and Mansoor, kindly unmute them so we can take the question. There are two online questions they have written in their chat box. First is preserving dignity is a must. Secondly, having a guaranteed basic income would also help people to take risk and think out of box. Two questions.
Very good. Very so.
Two questions. How would you compare this intervention with a guaranteed employment scheme? Second, how would poor become eligible? Is it based on their self-assessment?
Good question.
Another, our participant has mentioned, UBI pilots have shown that they have a positive impact on all the factors that you mentioned in your presentation. But don't you think this is only half the picture? The other half would be the impact of the redistribution that is inherent when you try to fund the UBI scheme. My question is, how can a pilot be designed in a manner that it can also address the full impact of the way it is funded? Whether it is through increasing income tax rates, just plain printing more money, etc.
So in the order they were asked, is protecting dignity a must? For me, yes. I mean, the experience of shame, as anyone who has had it, can be debilitating and is enormously painful. And I think to the extent that we wish to improve human well-being, advancing dignity it has to be the absolute heart. If we respect humans as humans, then dignity is essential. Risk taking and whether or not the UBI advances or supports risk-taking? Yes, 100%. Many pilots have shown this all around the world, and our data show the same. I've got many stories of people who invested in productive assets that they wouldn't otherwise have invested in. One woman who is a tailor in Hyderabad said for a long time she'd been saying to her husband, buy me a cycle so that I can go and sell my wares. And he said, no, we can't afford it, and yeah, and vor. And then the basic income came, and because the basic income came, her husband agreed, she bought the motorcycle, and now she sells her wares elsewhere. Also a story of an Indian participant who took time off work, and whose wife took time off work when her new baby arrived, in order to spend time with that baby, right? These are risks that the poor sometimes cannot take. So yes, there's an overwhelming body of evidence that providing increased security increases the likelihood of people taking risks, which could then be economically beneficial for them. How do I think this scheme, how does a basic income scheme as an ideal for social security compare to the ideal of guaranteed employment? In my evaluation, very favorably. One, I don't even think guaranteed employment is a normatively desirable outcome. You know, employment is wage slavery at the end of the day, right? When we are employed, we are still at the behest of someone, and in many cases, if not all, we are exploited. So for me, and this obviously reflects my political predilections and background, the goal of full employment is a debatable moral goal in and of itself, right? And I think that the goal of universal human security outside of wage dependency is far more exciting and emancipatory. That notwithstanding, you know, socialist commitments notwithstanding, the goal of guaranteed employment is dead everywhere. It never even existed here. And it definitely doesn't exist anymore in a meaningful, real terms where I'm from, right? The vast majority of people in the subcontinent exist in what is ridiculously called the informal economy, right? In other words, they're eking out a living. They're engaged in, you know, struggles of economic survival, right? What full employment are we possibly going to be bringing to these people, particularly as mechanization takes further root and automation increases? The same is true where I am from, or at least the same trends of automation and displacement of labor remain true. So for me, the notion that guaranteed employment could possibly be the answer to economic insecurity is a complete and utter chimera. With regards to eligibility, how are people eligible? If I understood the question correctly, how would people be eligible? The entire point of a UBI is that everybody is eligible. And in having everybody be eligible, we avoid precisely the targeting errors that you were mentioning earlier, and the extreme costliness and cumbersomeness and weightiness of the administrative bureaucracies that are required to police targets and behavioral conditionalities. The last piece around redistribution, yes, I think the redistributive implications of a basic income and its funding are as attractive and potentially inspiring as the sort of freedom and dignity enhancing outcomes of receiving a basic income. Anyone from a progressive standpoint who advocates for basic income, unless they're advocating for it being funded through progressive taxation, they're only doing half of the job. Necessarily, a basic income has to be funded through the progressive redistribution of resources, which has and contains within it the added value of limiting and weakening elite power, at least in principle. As to whether a pilot could be designed that combines these two halves, the funding and the distribution, I don't think so, basically. I think the only possible way that we can test that is by pushing the button and doing it, much in the way of any other major national policy, like a pension or a child support grant. The complexities involved and the resources involved are so great that you may as well just push the button of the policy and then course correct if you need to, in the way that policymakers have course corrected over generations. So I don't think a pilot is viable or even necessary that that covers both the cost and the distribution basis. I think you press the button of adopting the policy and then you course correct.
Hello, my name is Maheen and I'm
there.
MPhil public policy student.
Hi there.
Yeah. My question is, in your pilot study, you combined two components. One was cash transfer and other was organizing committees.
Mm,
So what are the isolated impacts of each intervention, if I say? Is it necessary with cash transfers, we need to have organizing committees, or solely cash transfers will have the same impact that you had?
Great question, thanks. It's unlikely that cash transfers alone will have the same impacts. The previous basic income pilot that took place in South Asia was run by the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. And this was a controlled experiment that gave some villages nothing, some villages just cash, and some villages cash plus union organizing. And in most respects, the latter did better. So there was something beneficial about the organizing as it interacted with the cash. How do we disaggregate the impacts of the two interventions? In some cases, we can't. And in some cases, we attempted to disaggregate through particular questions in the survey and particular qualitative conversations and observations. And so in certain instances, for example, the establishment of the union, it's impossible for me to tell you that this was more down to the cash and more down to the organizing. What I know is that the cash bred trust, it bred connection, it bred faith in the organizers, and the organizers' presence and their approach to support, which was unconditionality, allowed space for the union to give birth, right, or to be born. By contrast, if we look at things like health expenditure or food expenditure, obviously we know that that's not to do with the community organizers, and people identify, you know, the three greatest impacts of the cash were health, education, well-being, right? So we are being directly told, and or there are outcomes that are very particular to one or the other intervention. So that's how we've attempted. I could say more, but that's how we've attempted to disaggregate sort of by each specific outcome and according to each particular intervention. For this country and for elsewhere, the vision that I have of the post-revolutionary world, or the pathway to it, is this universal economic security and a massive cadre of community organizers who are embedded in every single community all around whichever country we are talking in, who are there to build relational power, whose job is to listen and to build connective tissue and to support people to act in whatever ways they need to address their problems, right? Our organizers, they weren't just, you know, rabble-rousers. It wasn't just about protest. It wasn't just even collective action. They were also social workers. So they connected people to services. They took people to the hospital. They helped kids with their homework. They mediated conflicts within households. And many households just ignored them. Many households didn't really want to talk, didn't really want to participate. But the point is that they were there, and what they were there to do was support that which emerged, to tend the ground, if you like. I am absolutely convinced of the power of this work, and generations of organizing tell us that more or less similar approaches to organizing all over the world have transformative impacts. So yeah, for me, the dream very much would be cash and relational security, both provided by the state.
Right. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for coming to PIDE and presenting such a wonderful work that you have done in multiple countries. And obviously, you know, as a human, when we talk about UBI or we listen about all the research work that's done, it's something that seems very attractive. It's something that we always happens, but the economist in me always has a few questions attached to it, right? The first one, obviously, regarding the program design and especially comparing that with the pilot. So there are two fundamental questions that come into my mind. Number one, the pilot study that was conducted, if I'm not wrong, it was obviously in financially poor communities, right? Which obviously presents a very good impact of the UBI. But when we're talking about UBI, we're talking about giving it to all communities regardless of their financial conditions. So if this is implemented on a macro level in all communities, obviously the impact and the results would change.
Absolutely.
Right? So wouldn't that make this entire case of UBI in itself slightly weaker if we actually see how it might impact in an overall economy? Number one. Secondly, again, the resources that we might be providing to those who might not be needing that kind of social assistance, right? So that kind of adds on to an inefficiency in allocation of resources in two terms. One, it's obviously providing an indifferent amount to those who might not need it, and also taking away a lot of money from areas where you might be able to provide it. And thirdly, I would also like to take your comment on how do you think the program design actually helps in increasing the efficiency of it? Because as Dr. Sujat also talked about, how in Pakistan we have multiple social assistance programs, and we also have very subsidized essential services provided to the people. But yet there is a huge inefficiency within those programs, and also the quality of those essential services, whether education or hospitals in public sector, that is very poor. So why not use those resources instead of giving UBI? Why not use those resources to improve those essential services in the country? And maybe what does seem from your presentation also is that it makes a good you could say argument for social assistance to vulnerable communities, but not access to overall the universal basic income per se, right?
Lovely questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and lastly, one thing, also about what kind of, we could say, the economic messaging that a UBI might give, right? So when you're talking about UBI based on varying based on household sizes, so isn't that an incentive to have larger household sizes, which again is a very major problem for a country like Pakistan? We're talking about population as well as household sizes in rural areas and communities. So how do you see that as compared to maybe providing it to households regardless of the household size in itself? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll take these in reverse order. So is it an incentive to have more children? I think it's unlikely, given that the amounts we're talking about are likely to be relatively low. They're going to be significant enough. Any UBI that is anywhere going to be viable, political, economically, will need to be large enough to make a difference, small enough to be scalable. And it's highly unlikely that the receipt of an extra 500 or 1,000 rupees would incentivize you to have more children. We also haven't seen from the data that exists in previous pilots any rapid increase in birth rate. So there's no empirics that suggest that if people have this security, they will have more kids. And if we look at the long-term trend data, demographic data over the past couple of centuries, the trend is in the opposite direction. Greater economic security means typically fewer children. So that's a concern I think that we could perhaps move beyond. The second piece, going in reversed order, around what I understand to be the sort of the trade-off between universal basic income and universal basic services. I reject that as an opposition a priori. And I think from the standpoint of progressive civil society, progressive politics, progressive social policy, we need to reject that as a trade-off. We need good quality public services, whether that be here or whether that be there. A hospital can do for you what cash can't, but cash can do for you what a hospital can't, right? Likewise, a school can do for you something that transport can't do, but transport can do for you something that a school can't do. We shouldn't be looking at this as either or. That is to fall into the distributional trap that I outlined at the start of my talk, of accepting that there's only so much to go around. This is the size of the cake. That is a political and economic terrain of contestation. It's not a given fact. And so I think we have to avoid, particularly amongst those of us who broadly agree that better public service and public security provision is the goal, we need to avoid ever pitting two sides of these coins against each other. In terms of efficiency, we know that there are enormous leakages in the provision of public services and in the provision of social assistance everywhere, and particularly in South Asia. There are considerable bottlenecks that lead to avenues for corruption. There's a lot of patronage. There's money that doesn't even get distributed. In India, my comrades have been mapping money allocated for social transfers that simply hasn't been spent, not even because someone has been eating it, but because they haven't got the administrative system in place to send it out to the targeted beneficiaries. All of this is fuel to the fire of a very simple and arguably efficient system, which is just to give the money to everybody and to do so with no strings attached. So for me, one of the major attractions of the idea of universality and the two forms of unconditionality is precisely this. It has the potential to be infinitely more efficient and to strip away some of the architecture that allows for civil political predation. With regards to this, the strength of the case that is made, there's a reason why most of the pilots that take place in the world are with the very poor, right? And that is that folks are in greater need, and therefore, to some extent, the moral urgency and the moral weight of the evidence is greater. Of course, when you make the choice to work with the poor almost exclusively, you're working with a non-representative sample of the population, even if we can accept that in many countries of the world, the poor are the overwhelming majority. So I think that the data that we've got, excuse me, the data that we have from pilots such as this they tell us stories that are likely applicable to the majority, even if they're not applicable to everybody. So they already have substantive advocacy weight. Would the case change if we included the middle and the upper classes? Plausibly. Although from my own standpoint, if we find that this extra bit of money isn't transformative, that doesn't really matter. That's what we can expect. These are not the people who are the likely aggregate beneficiaries. In the end, the aggregate beneficiaries of a basic income scheme will be those at the lower end of the distribution curve because it's a progressive redistribution of resources. That being said, of course, there is a sizable middle who may not be immediate net beneficiaries, but who, by virtue of the precarity of life, could suddenly find themselves in need of the security provided by a basic income floor that they wouldn't previously have had. That all ties into sort of questions around giving the money to everybody and including the rich in that. My common response to this is that, firstly, we're not wasting any money. There's nothing inefficient in giving it to everybody because we simply recoup it from the rich anyway. The rich are net losers in a basic income scheme. That said, there is a moral power to universal transfers that makes them harder to get rid of. We know this from sort of political institutional research around welfare provision, certainly in the global north and certainly in the UK. The universal grants, child grants, for example, are much harder for conservative politicians to roll back. Even if people don't need them, they like them. Likewise, things like universal access to high quality healthcare. Where I come from, the National Health Service has become almost like a religion, right? Even amongst the wealthy. And that's because it provides top quality service, or at least it did, to everybody, which meant that it was for generations untouchable by the regressive forces that tend to govern society. So there's political capital to be gained from universal approaches, which may at first blush seem quite rightly inefficient.
I think it's a good debate because in Pakistan, we are in a transition where we are expanding the social protection programs. Around 2 years ago, when there was expansion of universal health insurance program, that GIZ, that is supporting the Sehat Sahulat program. And I have a talk with them. They were quite, that optimistic that we should have universal health coverage. And there was one guy, France, who was from Germany. I asked him that, look, right now our per capita income is just $1,400. When the Germany have this per capita income, he said in 1923 or 24. And when US have this level of per capita income, that was, I think, in late 18th century, 18, for example, 96. So that a lot of right now social protection initiatives in Pakistan are happening whatever, that our per capita income is 100 years back, but we have been suggested to initiate, like, for example, even conditional cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers, and there is lot of duplication, lot of, that overlapping, and lot of people are getting intervention from multiple programs, and many of them are being excluded. So I think this is a good debate that let's the academics, they have to review all these models, and you have their own opinion. UBI, I think that is also a good thing to debate, that how it can create the enabling factors at household level as well as at community level. Whatever I have observed, that that poor households, they have lot of constraints within the household. They don't have the motivation. For example, go in Gujarat, every child who have age of 10 year or 12 year, it have the thrust that he will go abroad. So whether legal or illegal, he will must try. So migration, that could be a push factor, but you cannot find these migration factors in interior Sindh or in certain other areas. So you must have to look the household constraints, that how this household they can grow up, and what are the enabling factors that require. For example, same could be the bottlenecks of the microfinance initiatives. For example, if you initiate microfinance programs in Fuzdar, Avaran, where you don't have any market connectivity, so how these programs can work? So the role of government is quite crucial, that first you give the basic necessities to the people, that is education, that is health, that is water. And especially one thing is that still our social protection programs, they are looking that, okay, we will give goats, we will give buffaloes, that poultry, grocery stores. uh, I think give internet to the children. So give this universal internet to every children, so they can grow up. For example, I can tell you about me. When I joined in PhD, I first time, that developed my email ID. And my child is now in grade 2, and he is developing presentation on Canva. So this is the change. So bring this change directly, rather than, that still. So government role is quite crucial first, that how we can strengthen up these community organizations. Whatever I have seen, that over the last 20 years, NRSP, PPF, they have made lot of effort, but we must have to evaluate whether these communities are able to initiate some programs, or still they are dependent that, okay, we throw more donor amount, and we carry few of the interventions. So Dr. Neil, we are highly thankful to you for coming by, for giving a very excellent lecture, and I hope some of our students, they will definitely extend your work, and we look further collaboration with you. uh, this is your institute, so you are most welcome whenever you want to come. Thank you. Thank you.